is a Hello, welcome to Walk in the Park. My name is Tony Ingram, and this is episode 207, recorded on November 21st, 2018. You can see all my episodes at walkinthepark.tv. That's my website, my video blog, and you can see all my episodes there. So you don't have to just watch it on television. You can see it online as well. Okay, so we're going to go to the Cayuga Nature Center, which, as you may know, is up the west side of Cayuga Lake, about 6 or 7 miles on the way to Taganic Falls. You can see it there on the map. We're going to zoom in, and there's the building, the main building of the Cayuga Nature Center, and we're going to go in there to see their brand new this summer, the Cayuga Lake Aquarium exhibit. So let's go right there. We're going to be with Warren Allman, who is the director of the Cayuga Nature Center, as well as the Paleontological Research Institution and the Museum of the Earth. Okay, so I'm with Warren Allman, who's the director of the Paleontological Research Institution, Museum of the Earth, and Cayuga Nature Center. So tell us about this new exhibit at Cayuga Nature Center.
So this exhibit shows what has changed about Cayuga Lake since the arrival of Europeans. So we have two 650-gallon freshwater aquaria, one for Cayuga Lake today and one for Cayuga Lake before Europeans arrived about 230 years ago. So the present tank shows the fishes that live in the lake today, some of the invertebrates, we've got some crayfish in there, and the tank from the past shows fishes that lived here when Europeans arrived. And there's a surprising number of differences. There are species that used to live in the lake that don't live here anymore, or that live here but don't breed here. Maybe they're artificially stocked. And then there are species that have been added here. At least 9 species weren't here when Europeans arrived, but were introduced either intentionally or accidentally. And many of those species have changed the ecology of the lake dramatically. And so those are some of the stories that we want to tell in this exhibit.
Okay, so someone walks in here, and we're on the north end of the exhibit, I guess you could say right now. So how would they interface with this exhibit, and how would they know how to move through it, and how would they move through it, do you think?
So as soon as you walk in, you see this introduction to Cayuga Lake. So we have long here at the Nature Center wanted to have an exhibit that talked about the structure, the function, the physics, the chemistry of the lake, and that's what this exhibit does here. It also talks about biodiversity and sources of change. That's really what this exhibit is about, is change. And so this exhibit introduces visitors to the idea that the lake has been changing for thousands of years and will continue to change in the future. Now, the major source of change is human influence, but there have been non-human sources of change, and so we want visitors to think about what are the causes and effects of change in the lake, and how do human changes interface with those natural changes. Because if you don't understand natural and human changes, you can't decide whether human changes are necessarily a good or a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the neat things on this portion of the exhibit? I know you showed me this screen down here.
So anybody who's jumped in Cayuga Lake knows that it's warmer in some seasons than in others. So September is the warmest month in Cayuga Lake. The winter and the spring are not warm. If you want to understand that a little better, you look at this digital model here. This is a thermal model of the lake that shows how the upper few meters of the lake change their temperature distribution at different seasons. And we all know this kind of intuitively if we jump in and feel where does the water cool down as you jump in. That's called the thermocline, and the position of the thermocline changes different places in the lake at different seasons, and that's what this digital model shows. And then we also just want to introduce people to the idea that most people know the lake is a long, skinny lake, north-south trending lake, that it's very deep, 430 feet deep. But it's beyond that, it's a surprisingly complex lake. The number of small watersheds that drain into the lake, the sources of input into the lake, most of those are at the south end. And so most of the sources of pollution, of sediment input, of nutrient loading, those are all at the south end of the lake. So we try to talk about that. And then we try to link all of that to the biodiversity of the lake. How many species live in the lake? Why? What are the food webs of the lake? How do those work? And then that hopefully sets the stage for people to see what's in the aquaria here and how food webs in particular have changed with the introduction of some of these new species. For instance, round gobies are one of the most recent arrivals here in Cayuga Lake. They've been here just less than a decade, and they have completely changed the structure of bottom assemblages in the lake, shallow bottom assemblages in the lake. The good news, people might say, is they eat zebra mussels. But that means another change. Zebra mussels came in about 20 years ago. They changed the ecology of the lake. Well, now round gobies are here. They're changing it again. That's not a good or a bad thing, but it's an important thing to understand that this new introduced species of round goby is now this huge new source of food for some of the big game fishes that we have here in the lake, like lake trout and salmon. Is that going to change their populations permanently, or are round gobies the population going to eventually fall as that reequilibrates? We don't know. But round gobies have utterly changed the bottom fauna of the lake in just the last decade.
Gee. Wow. So let's take a look at this tank over here. Okay, Warren, will you tell us about what this tank is about?
So this tank represents Cayuga Lake before the arrival of Europeans. Europeans, although they passed through here in the 16 and early 1700s, really Europeans didn't arrive here until after the Revolutionary War. So in the 1790s, this might have been what Cayuga Lake looked like. And so here we have representatives of some of the species that would have been in the lake then. We should say that there's about 90 species of fish in the lake today, about 10 of which weren't present 200 years ago. So the past and present fish faunas of the lake are about the same, but there's some important differences. So what we see in here are a bluegill or a pumpkin seed, some largemouth bass, some smallmouth bass, and some landlocked salmon. Also, we have some yellow perch in here. Now, all of these species are present today in the lake in different abundances maybe, but all of these species are present. But landlocked salmon are an especially interesting story. So many of the people who come to fish in Cayuga Lake are fishing for salmon, and we have beautiful 20, 30-pound salmon that come out of the lake from time to time. So where do those fish come from? They were here 200 years ago. Well, why are they here today? Yes, they are, but they're only here today because the DEC stocks them. Why, if they were here 200 years ago, does the DEC need to stock them? Why aren't they here naturally? Well, it turns out an introduced species, a little herring called the alewife, which came into Cayuga Lake in 1825 through the Erie Canal, emits a chemical that keeps landlocked salmon, which were native here, from successfully reproducing. So the salmon which were here 250 years ago were fished out, and then the alewife was introduced, and alewife accidentally, not on purpose, keep the salmon from reproducing. And so if we want to have salmon in the lake today, the DEC have to stock them.
Is that thiaminase you were mentioning?
Thiaminase comes from the alewife, who excreted into the water, which interrupts the development of the fry, the baby salmon. Huh. So what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is beware unintended consequences. So alewife were introduced accidentally through the Erie Canal, and they had this completely unexpected consequence of rendering a huge, important apex predator game fish, the landlocked salmon, unable to reproduce in the lake. So we have some small landlocked salmon here. Ours, of course, come from a hatchery, and they're beautiful fish. They're lovely fish. These are small, but if we keep feeding them and letting them exist in the tank, they could get up to 10 or 15 pounds.
Wouldn't have a lot of room to move.
And wouldn't have a lot of room to move, so we'll be taking the fish out of here and putting them in the lake.
Right. Does that phenomenon also affect the lake trout?
No, it does not. And so for reasons that aren't completely understood, all the other big game fish, the lake trout, the rainbow trout, the brown trout, are all able to reproduce. They're closely related to salmon, but they're able to reproduce in the lake. They're all stocked also, but several of the streams at the south end of the lake do have breeding trout runs in the spring, which people are familiar with. But salmon are unable to reproduce. So the other interesting thing we have here in this tank are largemouth bass and smallmouth bass, which are widely distributed across eastern North America and the Midwest, and are probably pretty familiar fish to most people here in the lake. They're actually difficult to tell apart. They can get quite large. I like thinking about largemouth bass because largemouth bass will literally eat anything they can fit in their mouth, including baby ducks, frogs, rodents. They're voracious predators of all sorts. So they are present in both of our tanks here. They were present before Europeans, and they're still present today. Same thing for yellow perch, which are very popular game fish. Probably the most popular, most caught fish in the lake are yellow perch. Lake trout, we're unfortunately not able to keep in these tanks, and that's also for an interesting reason. We want to keep the maximum number of species in these tanks. Lake trout, as most people who fish in the lake know, prefer extremely cold temperatures, in the low 50s Fahrenheit. So we keep these tanks at about 57 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's a little too warm for lake trout.
Yeah, they kind of follow the temperature.
Exactly. They would like to be just a little 5 degrees colder than that. So we've experimented with keeping lake trout at 57 degrees. They don't like it. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to keep lake trout in here because if we kept the temperature at 52, we wouldn't be able to keep all these other species that live in shallower depths the rest of the year. Yeah. So unfortunately, we won't have kind of the premier game fish that everybody's familiar with here. But we have a model of a lake trout over here, and we talk about lake trout a lot in the exhibit because they are the fish that most serious anglers are really interested in pursuing in most of the Finger Lakes. Seneca Lake, and particularly Geneva, calls itself the lake trout capital of the world.
Yes. And the lake trout, in the summertime, people really have to catch them in the deeper water because that's where it's colder. Yeah.
That's right. So another thing that we talk about in the exhibit is vertical migration of these species and lateral migration. So as the temperature changes, as you see in the exhibit here, as the temperature changes vertically, the fish migrate in and out of shallow water. And so, as you said, in the summer, you won't see lake trout in shallow water. In the winter or early spring, you'll see lake trout in shallow water. But as the summer heat comes on, you'll only see lake trout in deeper water.
Okay, so now we're at the Cayuga Lake present tank.
So in this tank, we have some of the species that were not present 250 years ago. Of course, there are still lots of species. Most of the species in the lake were present 250 years ago. But of the 90 or so fish species that live in the lake, about 10 weren't present 250 years ago, and some of those are here in this tank. The thing that draws your attention immediately are the big yellow goldfishy looking things. Those are indeed koi, which are actually a variety of carp. There are a couple of varieties of carp in the lake. There's the great big kind of Asian carp that you think about that looks a little bit more like a wild fish. But then there are koi, and they are exactly what they look like. They are ornamental goldfish that have been intentionally or accidentally introduced into the lake. And so we have some fair-sized koi here. We have two species of trout, and people may or may not know that rainbow trout and brown trout, which are extremely common in the lake and extremely common across the world, are only native to particular places. So brown trout, which are perhaps one of the most broadly distributed freshwater fishes in the world, are native to Western Europe. Rainbow trout are native to the Pacific Northwest of North America and the northeast part of Asia. So Russia and Japan area, Kamchatka. But those two species, rainbow trout and brown trout, have been almost universally introduced around the world onto virtually every continent except Antarctica. And so almost everybody's familiar with them. So we have some beautiful little rainbow trout and some brown trout here. We also have a species called the channel catfish here, which you will not see in the lake unless you know where to look. They're bottom-dwelling fishes that like to hide in vegetation. Channel catfish are native to North America, but not to the Finger Lakes. Right. So also in this tank we have the famous round goby, and that was introduced accidentally into the Finger Lakes about a decade ago. You have to look hard. How did it get in? In ballast water. So it came in through the St. Lawrence River into the Great Lakes, and then eventually into the Finger Lakes from there. And it was first recorded in Cayuga Lake in 2009. And you will see them everywhere in shallow water in Cayuga Lake right now. You can catch them with almost out trying by dropping almost an empty hook into the water and pulling them out.
How big do they get?
They get maybe 6 or 8 inches long. They're a bottom-dwelling fish. And they're very well adapted to that. They kind of have a flat belly, and they have fins that splay out to the side that kind of look like they're resting on the bottom, and that's exactly what they're doing. You have to look hard for them here in the tank. They're bottom-dwelling fish, and they like to hide at the bottom. And they are incredibly numerous in the lake today. Now here in the tank, we represent zebra mussels with these plastic models here, but zebra mussels, pretty much everybody's familiar with. They reached Cayuga Lake about 20 to 25 years ago, mid-1990s, and immediately affected the ecology of the lake. Zebra mussels are famous for encrusting every available surface, and so they clog up water intake valves and pipes, but they also are voracious filter feeders, and so they pump huge quantities of water and strain the food out, and so the lake became much clearer 20 years ago.
Like a liter a day or something.
Incredible pumping capacity for these little clams. Yeah. And if you walk along the lake today, everywhere, you'll see the shells of zebra mussels. Right. Enter the round goby. Zebra mussel populations are now on the decline because round gobies have been eating them. And again, you may say, well, that's a good thing. We're getting rid of those zebra mussels. But again, the lake has kind of learned how to live with zebra mussels over the last 20 years, and now the zebra mussels are leaving. So it's yet another change in the lake. And so, again, that's what this exhibit's really about, is to get people to think that the lake is constantly changing, and we need to pay attention to that, what are the causes and the consequences of those changes.
Some of those changes might actually be, in a sense, experienced as shock, do you think, to the ecosystems? Or?
The zebra mussel sure was. Zebra mussels, when they got here, and this is true across North America, wherever they've been introduced, have contributed to the disappearance of native mussel species. They've certainly shocked a lot of infrastructure systems by clogging up intake pipes and things. And they, if you've tried to walk around in shallow water here, you cut your feet on them, so they've changed the benthic structure, the bottom living structure of the fauna here, out-competing other species, and they clear up the water, and so that changes visibility, which changes the amount of light that reaches the bottom, which changes the amount of macroalgae and large plants that live, which changes the bottom conditions for the fishes. So the law of unintended consequences, when these species get introduced, either accidentally or intentionally, it isn't just we have a new fish. It's we have a whole set of consequences for the entire ecosystem. So yeah, some you might characterize some of it as a shock. You might characterize some of it as kind of a slow building catastrophe or a slow building major change. One of the points is that you can't always predict what those changes are going to be.
Right. Okay, Warren, tell me about this final section here.
So we call this last section fish stories. And just like the fish stories you tell at the barbershop, on Monday. So these are really short biographies of some of the more charismatic species of fishes that live in the lake. And we characterize them by introduced and native, and that's really one of the themes here. We want to get people thinking which species are native, which species were here before Europeans, that's what native means, which species have come along since Europeans. Remember, introduced and invasive are not the same thing. Introduced means humans are responsible for it being here, whether this new species has a negative effect or not. If it has a strong negative effect, then that's characterized as invasive, if it harms the native biota. So we tell some of the species here, and remember there's about 90 species of fishes in Cayuga Lake. We tell a few of those stories here of some of the sexier, more charismatic species. Just a couple of fun things here. Lots of people are familiar with sturgeon, which are now for the first time spawning in Cayuga Lake again, thanks to a huge effort by the state of New York over more than a decade. This is a model of a decent-sized adult sturgeon. Many people think that sturgeon are being reintroduced to Cayuga Lake after being absent for a while. They were native, and we should be bringing them back. Well, we are bringing them back, but there is no strong evidence that sturgeon were here when Europeans arrived. So we're spending a lot of money and effort to bring sturgeon back to Cayuga Lake, but they probably got here about 1825 when the Erie Canal opened. At least that's the best evidence available. There's no archaeological or other evidence that sturgeon were here prior to Europeans. So nothing wrong with bringing them back, but they probably weren't native. Right. On the other hand, people love to hate this fish over here, the sea lamprey. Sea lampreys have one of the more unpleasant habits of any of the fish in Cayuga Lake. They are parasites. They're jawless fish that latch on with their very distinctive round mouths and drill a hole in the side of their prey and suck the fluids out. They don't kill their prey, or their host, but they definitely hurt it, and they look ugly, and that's what local anglers don't like. So lampreys are not very popular. However, there's no evidence that lampreys are introduced. In fact, there's good evidence that lampreys were here when Europeans arrived. So what are we doing? We're spending a lot of money getting rid of lampreys, which is a native species, and we're spending a lot of money stocking sturgeon, which is an introduced species. And again, this isn't wrong or right. It's just really interesting and important for people to know kind of the biology and the natural history of these species so they can be more informed about how the lake works and how it used to work. Yeah. Here's another interesting species. This is the American eel. And eels were once much, much more abundant here in the Finger Lakes than they are today. Right. And the interesting thing about eels is that they live part of their life in freshwater and part of their life in saltwater. They spend most of their life in the Atlantic Ocean, and then they swim up freshwater waterways to live the rest of their life. In fact, American eels were first described in 1817 from the Finger Lakes. Oh, really? And there used to be a very large economic fishery of eels in New York State. Now, because of dams and fish weirs and so forth, eels are much less common in the inland waters of New York State because they can't swim from saltwater into freshwater.
So where do they spend the most part of their life cycle?
They spend most of their time, probably a good 10 years, in the middle of the Atlantic before they swim back.
Sargasso Sea?
And probably in the Sargasso Sea, in the middle of the western Atlantic Ocean. Yeah. That's right.
You have some neat screen over here.
And we have video of about half a dozen of these species so that people can see them in the wild, in addition to seeing them here in the tanks.
Right. So if people want to be able to identify the fish that are in the tanks, you have a neat chart over here for one.
We have charts over here to identify the species. We have staff here much of the time to answer your questions, and on weekends and during busy times here we have regularly scheduled programs for visitors, and we're going to be, this exhibit opened in August 2018, and we've been working really hard for the last couple of months to develop new programming. So if you're interested in this topic or these kinds of topics, give us a call. We have programs that we can do here. We have programs on these topics that we can do off-site for teachers, classes at all levels. We're really looking forward to doing more programming around the natural history and evolution and ecology of all the species in Cayuga Lake today.
So you have a whiteboard out here that has a list of fish on them on a daily or weekly basis?
So depending on what season it is, depending on the health of the fishes that we've got in the tanks here, depending on what we're able to source from hatcheries, et cetera. We'll have different species here at different times of year. We can keep lots of fishes in here, lots of different species, but it'll change from time to time. So we will always try to have a variety of species. So we try to emphasize the introduced species here in the present tank, while we'll try to emphasize the native species in the past tank.
Right.
But
So is there a interface with some of the other educators in the area, like the Discover Cayuga Lake and other folks that are interpreting the lake?
So one of the things that we're most excited about is that this exhibit gives us a reason to interact with a lot of our educational partners. We've long had a relationship with what used to be called the Floating Classroom, now Discover Cayuga Lake, and we're looking forward to having a much bigger relationship with them and other educational partners in the basin, because lots of us do different pieces of the natural history of Cayuga Lake. Our role at the Nature Center here is to talk about basic evolution and ecology and natural history of the species that live in the Cayuga Basin, and to talk about the environmental history of the Cayuga Basin and how those species live together here, and how humans have impacted those environmental and biodiversity relationships. There's a whole host of other topics, of course, that other educational organizations deal with. We try to focus on what we do best, which is talk about ecology and evolution, and also local and regional and global climate change and how those impact those local biodiversity and ecological relationships.
Well, that's fantastic. This is really an exciting development and something that's been a long time coming in the Finger Lakes. So,
a long time coming.
Yes, yes. Like since the Ice Age, I think.
Yes, in fact, 10,000 years in the making, that's right.
Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Warren.
Tony.
Okay. Okay, so there it is, an exciting new exhibit, jam-packed with information about Cayuga Lake. So take a trip on up to the Cayuga Nature Center sometime soon. All through the good thing to do in the winter. It's an indoor thing. There's a lot of other exhibits at the Cayuga Nature Center. So encourage you to check them out. It's exciting. It's been for a while. I know that people have been talking about the need for such an aquarium type of exhibit for a long time, and now we have one. So and then, like he said, that will complement so many other things, and also add some sort of basic information to a lot about the lake that we're so familiar with, but maybe don't know as much as we thought we did. So well, thank you for joining me and Walk in the Park, and I encourage you, even in the chilly weather, to go out and take a walk in the park. So we'll take this last little picture of Cayuga Nature Center and go to our final goodbye credits video. Is a